Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here to speak with you today. As Michaela said, I'm going to be talking with you about crafting competitive grant applications and obtaining funding for your non-animal research. So I'm Angela Bitvid. I am the program director at the Alternatives Research and Development Foundation. We make grants to researchers to develop alternative research methods. And I'm going to talk with you a bit about the process in general and hopefully give you some advice to help you become more successful in seeking funding for your work. So I know today's workshop is focused toward early career researchers, and I saw at the beginning that we have a lot of graduate students and postdocs, which is fantastic. And so I'm assuming that a lot of you listening don't have extensive experience either looking for funding opportunities or preparing proposals in a more independent fashion. So that's really going to be the focus of what I talk about today. And I've split my talk into two sections. I'm going to talk first about types of funding opportunities, where to look for them, and how to figure out whether or not a particular funding program is a good fit for your research project. And this will also include talking a little about private funders versus public funders. And then the second half is really going to focus on tips and strategies for preparing a competitive application. So writing a really clear, well-written proposal, and then also tailoring your application to the funding opportunity that you plan to submit it to. So first off, types of funding opportunities. There are two sort of big categories that I think of these in, and the first is private funders, which are usually nonprofit organizations that often have a specific mission that they are making their grant awards in order to further this mission. And the source of funding here for these organizations is often private donations by members of the organization or different ways that they bring in the money, and direct it to this cause. So one example is advancing non-animal research methods. That is actually the mission of our organization and our grant program. And so that's how we focus our programs. Other organizations, there are more disease condition driven groups. So their focus might be to develop treatments for a specific disease. Private funders often have really broad latitude in how they set the review criteria and the eligibility requirements for their programs. So they can really sort of craft the program in a way that gets them the kind of research that they want. The other big category is public funders, and these are the public agencies. So we're thinking NIH, National Science Foundation in the United States, and they usually have a much broader mission to serve some aspect of the public interest. So they're using taxpayer money to serve the public good. And that's a little bit different in terms of how they craft their funding opportunities. So I'm going to take presenter's prerogative, if it's okay, and talk a little bit about our program specifically, because I use it as an example sort of as I move through the talk. So we are a private funder. ARDF was established in 1993 by the American Anti-Vivisection Society. As I said before, we are a mission-driven program. So we make grants with the goal of developing new methods that have the potential to reduce or replace the use of animals. We also have a really broad scientific scope. So we make awards that are focused on product testing, chemical testing, biomedical research, and also education. So the use of animals in the educational context. So the annual open grant program is our sort of flagship program. As the name indicates, we run this every year, and it is $40,000 for a one-year project. And this program is open to researchers around the world. So we have made awards to researchers in a lot of different countries throughout the lifetime of this program. Another program that we run is our AIR Challenge, which stands for Animals in Research. And this program focuses specifically on biomedical research. It does not run every year, but it usually has a particular focus, a particular topic that varies by the different grant cycles. And there are a lot of other private funders that you can consider when you are looking for funding for your project. I've listed a few here, but this is by no means a complete list of everything that exists. But these are a lot of programs that I would highly recommend learning a little bit more about. So the American Fund for Alternatives to Animal Research makes awards internationally. Animal Free Research UK also makes awards internationally. The Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, one of our organizers, makes international awards. Replacing Animal Research, which is formerly FRAME, has a UK-based eligibility, but anyone who's in the UK should check them out. The International Foundation for Ethical Research actually makes graduate fellowships. So they focus their grant dollars on funding graduate students in a specific, for a specific research project. And I believe that they are also renewable for another year, and they make international awards. So the grad students, I definitely encourage you to go check out their program. And then, of course, the Lush Prize. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Lush. They have their programs that are focused on toxicology for the most part, but they do make international awards. So I've also listed here sort of quasi-public. A lot of countries have a national 3R center, particularly in Europe. And some of these programs might be governmentally funded. Some of them might be partially governmentally funded and partially privately funded. But these 3R centers serve as really excellent resources, both of information about developing animal-free research, but also they can serve as a clearinghouse of funding opportunities within those particular countries. And in some cases, they also make their own awards. They run their own grant program. So if you're based outside the United States and your country has a national 3R center, I highly recommend taking a look at that as well. So this is just a list of a few of them, again, not a complete list. So public funders are more of federal, national research agencies and institutes. They're going to be more focused on a specific scientific area. So a disease or condition, maybe a particular technical challenge, either high throughput or predictive modeling, things like that. So they are going to be less geared toward animal-free research and more focused on addressing a particular scientific question. So as I said, they're less likely to have this explicit goal, but at the same time, there is a lot of funding available from these organizations for non-animal methods. It just might not be with the same mission of replacing animals in research. That said, there's actually a really exciting new opportunity at the NIH, which I think Dr. Bailey mentioned briefly, which is the complementary program, short for Complement Animal Research and Experimentation. And this is a really new initiative just launched this year from NIH that is explicitly focused on developing and standardizing human-based new approach methods, or NAMs. So this is, at this point, they have announced a plan for 10 years of funding. There is a plan of $390 million, 35 million a year in the first couple of years, up to 40 million a year for the subsequent years. So a lot of funding. As I said, this is really new. They are just starting to roll out some of their notices of funding opportunities, but I think I have the link on one of my next slides. Highly recommend signing up for their listserv because it is likely that they're going to be rolling out a lot of funding opportunities over the next couple of years. So in addition to the complementary program, there's also a lot of disease or condition focused funding opportunities that, again, might not come up as non-animal methods, but when you look into them, that's exactly what they are. So this is just one example I picked as I was searching through enabling biomimetic tissue engineered technologies for cancer research. This is out of NCI. So it's clear that this is the kind of work that they're putting money toward, but they might not be framing it in the same way that you're looking for if you're thinking strictly about replacing animals. Again, the National Science Foundation also has funding opportunities embedded throughout their scientific programs. This is another example focused on microphysiological systems. So it's really important to have a really broad scope when you're thinking about looking for funding and understanding that there could be a really great fit for your research project. It just might not be the program that would first come to mind. You have to do a little digging for it. But luckily, you have some help in finding some of these because there are a lot of really great organizations that work to compile different funding opportunities that are friendly to non-animal research projects. So I recommend, bookmarking these web pages, revisiting them because they are often updating and adding new opportunities to them. So I've got here the PETA Science Consortium International has a webpage. PCRM, one of our organizers, again, has a webpage where they list different funding opportunities. And the USDA Animal Welfare Information Center also has a resource page that lists different opportunities. In addition to that, you can sign up for email lists and newsletters from relevant programs. Again, you can't ask for anything easier than having funding opportunities show up in your inbox, right? So here's a list. The American Society for Cellular and Computational Toxicology does a lot of promoting in vitro methods, developing alternative methods, and a lot of sharing information and resources. The Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing also has a really terrific newsletter that you should sign up for because they share a lot of information about different funding programs. Institute for In Vitro Sciences, PCRM's ERA 21, NTP News. This is the newsletter of the National Toxicology Program, which is housed in NIH, and they have sort of been the locus of the federal government's efforts around alternatives. So they also get a lot of information from all the different organizations, and they compile that and send that out in their newsletter. So I would highly recommend signing up for their newsletter as well. The complimentary listserv is really easy to get on. And then the 3Rs Collaborative, this is sort of the North American equivalent of some of the different 3R Center. In this case, they are primarily privately funded, so they're a little different than some of the European centers, but they are also working to compile resources and opportunities and share them with people. Of course, again, NIH is one of the biggest players in this area. So I would also recommend just diving into the NIH guide for grants and contracts. Now, I will admit this can be a little overwhelming. As they say, it's sometimes like drinking from a fire hose. The NIH guide has all of the funding opportunities that NIH has. So anything that they're doing is going to be listed in this guide, but it's really easy to search. So this is the landing page. This is just a screenshot of one search that I did. I searched cardiac organoid, see what pops up. These are research projects from all of the different institutes and centers. And these are some examples of funding opportunities that appear. So as you can see, I think it says here there's 22 different ones that list cardiac organoids as being a topic of interest. So it requires a little work to try and sift through to find something that might be a good fit for you, but there is a lot of opportunity out there. Okay, so you found the perfect program for your project. You think it's a really good fit. You think you have something to contribute. So now the hard work begins, as we say. You have to prepare a competitive application. So I think about this as having two really important components. The first is writing a clear and compelling application, and then also tailoring your application to the research funder and their particular goal. So every funder has a goal that they want to accomplish. This is why they're making these grants. And your application needs to have a really clear and concise explanation of how your project will help them accomplish their goal. But I'm going to step back for a second, since I know we have folks who might not have been through this process before, and talk just a little bit about the grant review process. So this is a really high-level overview. It's going to be a little different from different organizations. Everyone's got their sort of own variation on these different steps. But in general, the process is such that once you submit your application to the program, the submitted applications are going to be reviewed for compliance. And what this means is they just want to make sure that your project is eligible for funding based on their different eligibility criteria. So using the example of our program, we cannot fund projects that use live intact animals, vertebrates or invertebrates in any part of the project. So some people say an applicant perhaps doesn't read our eligibility criteria very carefully and maybe assumes that we use the regulatory definition of animal research, which is slightly different, and submits a C. elegans proposal. So that is not eligible for funding by our program. So in this case, that project can't even be sent out for review. It basically gets screened out at this first step. And this really drives home, I think, the importance of reading very carefully the program requirements and the program guidelines. But once that step happens, all of the eligible applications are moved forward for review. This might be program staff or review staff. We're going to select reviewers. In some cases, the organization might have a standing committee of reviewers, and so the committee takes part in reviewing them. But either way, they're going to be scientific experts who are assigned to the proposal to give their expert opinion and evaluation. So once those reviewers are assigned, the reviewers assess the application based on the review criteria that the organization gives them. So this is a really important point to understand as well. Different programs will have different review criteria. And this is basically the funder telling the reviewer, here's what we want, here's what's important to us, and here's what we want you to tell us about these projects. So it's not just a vibes thing where the reviewers decide whether they like a project or don't like the project. They're given very specific instructions as to how they should assess the application and what kind of feedback the funders would like to hear from them. So usually they assess applications. Oftentimes there's a numerical score given in addition to text-based comments. They might list the strengths and weaknesses, or they will discuss what parts of the project caused them to give it the numerical score that they gave it. So both of these pieces of information, the score and the reviewer comments, will go back to the funder. Then the funder uses those assessments to make their funding decisions and decide which projects they're going to award grants to. Okay, so writing an effective, persuasive application. I think so there are these 4 components that I've listed here, and I should say that this is adapted from a very helpful short book called 4 Steps to Funding by Morgan Giddings. She's actually was a biomedical researcher, and she wrote this book about her experience of improving her grant writing and how improving her grant writing improved her funding success. And she identifies these 4 components that I really think are critical to having a compelling and competitive application. So the first thing that you need to address is why this project is interesting and important, right? This is really sort of the significance, the impact of the project. And it's important to have sort of a broad scope when you're thinking about this. So you want to explain this to the reviewer, to the funder, and perhaps to the general public. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the federal funders, they are accountable to the taxpayers for the research that they fund, right? And so it's important to think for them to understand as well how this project, what's the impact that it could have on the public good. So you really want to make sure you drive home why you think this project is going to be impactful, what the significance of the work really is. And again, this will sort of depend, we'll talk a little bit later about tailoring it as to what the goal of the program is. So another really important component that you have to address is who is going to do the work and why you are the perfect person to do it. So this is also a much broader section in the sense that it's not just about you, even if you're writing a proposal about work that you're going to do, but really about the research environment. And this can be other collaborators, other researchers on the team, perhaps data analysis experts that you plan to engage near the end of the project. And then also as I said, the research environment in terms of the facilities and the capacities, right? You have to demonstrate to the reviewers that you have access to the equipment needed, to the expertise needed, that you have everything in place to successfully carry out this project. So it's not just enough to say we're going to do imaging, but you need to explain to them how, what equipment do you have access to? Who's going to help you if this is not your area of expertise? How are you going to obtain image analysis assistance and all of that? So you really want to create a big picture for the reviewer to understand how this work would get done by the people who are doing it. But then you also want to talk about, of course, I think this is the core part, what are you proposing to do, right? So what's your hypothesis? What's your theory underlying your project? What is it that you are basing this project on? And then also how you will use the money to accomplish what you've proposed. And this is this can be a little tricky, I think, sometimes for first-time grant writers, because it's a little bit different than preparing a publication. So when you're submitting a manuscript for publication, it's really important that your method section be written at the level of detail so that someone can come along and redo your experiment, right? This is part of the reproducibility aspect. You don't need that level of detail in a grant application, and also you probably won't have room for that level of detail by the time you include all these other components, all these other aspects of what needs to be included. At the same time, you can't just say, we're going to do imaging, right? Because as I said, you really need to convey to the reviewer that you know how to do what you're proposing to do, right? And if you say, we're going to do imaging, they have no idea. If you have you ever done this before? Do you have what the expertise lined up to do it? So you kind of want to aim for the middle to really kind of spell out the different steps, you know, perhaps which variables or maybe the different concentrations that you're going to, the range that you'll include, and make it clear that you have thought through this very carefully. It's also really helpful to address some of the barriers or obstacles. You know, say, if it turns out that we can't grow the cells in these conditions, then we're going to try X, Y, and Z. Or if this doesn't work, we're going to retool and do this, which again is just demonstrating to them how thoughtfully and how carefully you have looked down the road to think through how the project will go. So once you have all of these components put together and you have a really compelling proposal that convinces reviewers that you are the one who is going to make this work succeed, then you need to think about tailoring your application to the funder or the program that you are submitting it to. So again, there's this issue of private funders versus public funders. And the reason this is relevant is because it really impacts what the mission of the program is. So you need to think about what the objective of this grant program is, because that's going to determine how you frame the project's significance, how the reviewers are going to assess the proposal. As we said, the funder is the one who's going to give them the review criteria to use. And then also what types of projects your application is going to be competing against. Right? So if you're applying to a program that is really focused on funding animal-free research with the goal of replacing animals, that needs to be addressed in how you're framing the significance of the project, right? You need to explain the impact, how this will reduce the use of animals or replace the use of animals if your project is successful. And also what other types of projects you'll be competing against. If you're submitting to a program like that, you're going to be competing against other non-animal, perhaps in vitro and silico methods. But if you're submitting to a much broader funding call, right, it might be that your MPS model is going to be in there being assessed against a mouse model for the same type of disease. So that, again, is going to affect how it is you want to describe your work and its significance and how you sort of set up the argument for what you're going to do. And then again, just as I said before, these program descriptions really tell you what the funders want. So it's important to pay attention. So as an example from our funding program, so research with the goal of reducing and replacing animals is a bit different from research that just happens to not use animals. And that's a subtle distinction, maybe. It's a little nuanced, but it's actually really important because what we are looking for is projects that are actively going to reduce or replace the use of animals. But if someone submits to us perhaps an MPS model for the cancer tumor microenvironment, that just happens to not use animals, but doesn't address anywhere in the proposal what the potential significance or impact this might be on our mission, then it's really hard for the reviewers to evaluate this highly favorably because it's not really addressing what we have said our mission is. Again, just to reiterate, you really want to write your application to the program description and the review criteria. So this tells you what the program's priorities and values are. And then the reviewer's job is really to take that information and to use that to assess the application. So again, this isn't so much the reviewer they're not going to put their own values and preferences into their assessment of it, but they're going to give the funder the information that they have asked for. But it's also important to not assume that the reviewers share your priorities or values regarding the importance of non-animal approaches, particularly if you are applying to some of these broader programs that aren't aiming at reducing or replacing the use of animals. And as we said, there is a lot of funding out there, and your project might be a really great fit for one of those programs, but you just have to keep this in mind as you're preparing your proposal. So you need to persuade the reviewers to try and understand the value and the benefit of the approach that you're presenting, and explain why your approach is the best way to answer this question. And then I would just also say, especially in this context, to be cautious about making really sweeping general statements about different research approaches. So it's one thing to say, our MPS model will allow us to really carefully examine the molecular mechanisms of this particular type of cell signaling, or it might allow us to examine this process in the looking at different genetic backgrounds of different human population. Those are really specific claims that you can make about why your approach is better than some of the other approaches. That's different than saying the mouse models in this area have not developed any useful information addressing this disease. That's a much bigger claim, going to require a lot more supporting evidence in order to back up that claim. And you also have to keep in mind that it's possible that one of the reviewers reviewing your application is someone who works in mouse models in this disease, and they might have a different definition of useful information than you do. So that's just something to keep in mind as you are thinking about the different programs and adjusting your application to them. So then you also, this is on a similar vein, ensure alignment with the program goals, right? So you do this by carefully reading the application guidelines and the eligibility criteria, and also look for any tips, FAQs, webinars. Oftentimes the funders will put together information where they really want you to understand what it is they're looking for. This again is just an example from one of our grant guidelines. We say, here are the tips for developing a successful proposal. If your proposal addresses these questions, if it answers these questions, then you are probably responding to the goals and the mission of our organization. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that funders really want to help you develop a proposal that is going to be competitive for their program. Just have to be able to find the information. Also, it's really important to ask for clarification. So if you have questions about different aspects of the project, for example, here's eligible costs. Again, for our program, we don't cover travel expenses. So if you don't read our guidelines carefully and you put $5,000 to attend an annual conference in your field, right, that's going to be a problem. You have ineligible costs listed in your budget. We also have a requirement for statements on the sourcing of reagents, and other organizations might have reporting or publication requirements. So read through all of this, and if there is anything you don't understand, contact the program staff. That is part of their job, our job. We are expecting people to ask us questions, and we really want to answer these questions in advance, because it's always unfortunate if a proposal comes in, there's either ineligible costs or there's an aspect of the project that makes it ineligible for funding. We understand that it takes a lot of time and effort to put these together. And so we really want to answer these questions before you submit it so that you can make sure that you submit an eligible proposal. So if you have readers or your mentor, someone who's going through your proposal as you're developing it, share the review criteria with them so they can help you assess your alignment of how you have structured your proposal, how you have framed your work with the program, and ensure that it's a good fit. And then following up a bit, what Dr. Krebs had mentioned, the CoLab author guide. This is a really helpful resource to talk a bit about reviewer assumptions about non-animal methods, so animal methods bias. And you can, I would suggest reading through this and thinking about how you can structure your argument, your statements to help preempt some of these concerns. Except I will note that the focus of the author guide is manuscripts where, here you're putting together a grant application, which is a little different. You don't have as much chance to sort of come back and respond to the comments in the same way that you would if you were submitting a manuscript. So, and finally, just some writing tips. Don't go this alone. There is no reason that you have to sort of think about this as a project that you have to do all by yourself, nor should you. It's really important to learn from your mentors, learn from your peers, ask people for their successful applications. It's always good to just sit down and read a few different applications, get a sense of the tone and the structure. If you can get your hands on a successful application for the program that you are submitting to, even better, because now you have a sense of what the reviewers saw and liked, right? And so don't think of this as something that you have to sort of sit down and figure out how to do by yourself. It is not that type of project. It really should be a collaboration with the people who are guiding you or training you. And then always have a second set of eyes on, frankly, any writing project, but especially a grant proposal. If you can have another scientist, that's great. Doesn't need to be someone who knows your project. Sometimes it's better to have someone who doesn't know your project because they can help point out places where you might have assumed knowledge that not everyone will have. But anyone can help catch typos. So I think it's always really important to make sure that at least someone else has read it before you submit it. Don't overlook the importance of high quality writing. I know it's easy to get caught up in the data, making sure your figures are perfect, making sure that everything is, your data is presented in a way that's really convincing. But it's also really important that the text is written well, right? Because unclear writing can obscure the importance or the feasibility of the proposed work. So you might have a really fantastic project, you have a great idea, you've got outstanding preliminary data, but if you can't explain what it is you want to do in a way that the reviewers understand so they can see this aspect of your work, then it's going to be really hard for them to score it favorably because they don't, if they don't fully understand what it is you want to accomplish. As I mentioned before, don't assume that everyone's going to have background knowledge of your project in particular. So what is obvious to you might not be obvious to your reviewer. And it's important to keep in mind that in most cases, there will be multiple reviewers assigned to your proposal. And usually these reviewers come from different perspectives, right? That's something that's done intentionally. So the program staff might assign, someone who's got the microscopy expertise to give them feedback about that aspect. And they might have someone who's got the cell signaling expertise to give them feedback on that. So there's going to be people who are reading through this, who are coming with their own sort of subset of knowledge, and you will need to explain to them some of the background that is going to seem really obvious to you because you've been doing it for a long time, but it's not going to be obvious to them. But it will be critical for them to understand how everything fits together. This next point might sound a little funny for a grant application in particular, but do anything you can to make your application a pleasure to read, right? Because I will say reviewers take their jobs really seriously. They really do want to do a good job. They want to understand your proposal and they want to give valuable feedback. So if you give sort of vague or overly complicated writing, this can just frustrate and annoy them and prevents them from really understanding the promise of your proposal. And then, of course, details matter. You don't want to have typos. You want to make sure and define all your acronyms. You need consistent usage of the language. Always be careful when repurposing text from another application. Everyone does this. We understand if you submit it to a program, you don't get funded. You'll probably take that project and maybe submit it to another program. But you want to make sure that you go through and remove any references to the old program, things like that. Read carefully. Okay, and finally, I'm almost done. Resubmitting an unfunded application. So it's really important to keep in mind the funding environment is highly competitive. Funders almost always get many more high scoring projects than they have the budget to fund. So you should not be discouraged if your proposal is not funded the first time around. There are many successful researchers who have not been funded on their first application to a new program. It is not personal. It is unfortunately how the system works right now. So ask program staff about any policies or expectations that their program has for submitting a revised application to future funding cycles. Some have a really formal structured process. For example, NIH has a very clear path for how you do a resubmission, and you will submit it as a resubmission and it gets reviewed as a resubmission. And then other programs have a less formal process, but they allow unfunded applicants to apply again with the same project. And the really nice thing about resubmitting is that it allows you to address some of the reviewer identified weaknesses using the feedback that the reviewers gave you. And it's almost always the case that when you submit a resubmitted or a revised application, it is a stronger, more competitive application. Okay, now the summary, again, funders need your help to accomplish their mission. They want to fund promising research projects that are aligned with their goals. This is why they have their programs. But the key to success is understanding what their goals are and then explaining to them how your project will help them accomplish it. But again, the first step is that you have to convince the reviewer of all of this. And in order to do that, you need to provide a clear and easy to understand description of what you're going to do, why it's important, why you are well suited to succeed in this proposal, and then connect the dots from your work to the funder's mission. And then finally, as I said before, anything you can do to make your application easy and enjoyable to read is a benefit to your reviewer. And don't be discouraged if you're not funded on your first try. Always consider resubmitting a revised application, and hopefully you will have better luck on the next try.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Angela. Great presentation. Lots of really amazing, useful information there. So we have a couple questions for you. The first one is, how do you protect the rights of your grant applications in terms of ideas? We hear about misbehaviors regarding plagiarism. Do you have any recommendations about that?
Oh, wow, that is, yeah, I mean, I don't have any advice in terms of ensuring that that won't happen. I mean, I think most programs have their own policies and practices in place. That's something that, NIH takes really seriously. We do. Most funders have mechanisms that they use internally. Now, that is not to say that it can't happen, that it's impossible, because there are instances of bad behavior, but most of the time reviewers are required to sign different confidentiality agreements. They agree, as part of taking on the task of being a reviewer, they agree that they are going to keep this information confidential, that they will not use it. And it is something that funders take very seriously. And if they find out that a reviewer has engaged in a practice like this, there are often consequences for that.
So the next question is, are you able to access who might be on a review panel prior to submitting? And if you are, how can you do that?
In most cases, I would say no. I think in some cases, so for example, NIH publishes the membership of different study sections, right? So you can get online and see the membership of study sections. What I cannot recall is what the delay is in that. So I'm not sure if that information is only available after the fact or if it is available. I should know this. If it's available when you're submitting. But for the most part, no, right? So in our case, absolutely not. We would never make any of that information available because we think it's really important for our process that the reviewers be able to give a frank assessment of the project. And I think anytime you know that your comments might be going back in an identifiable way back to the person, it creates sometimes a hesitation, perhaps to be as frank or to say exactly what you might think about it, because you'll be, maybe thinking about potential impacts or personal relationships, things like that. I will also say that most organizations have pretty strict conflict of interest policies. So, a reviewer who either has a publication history or maybe a mentor history with someone would not be allowed to review that application. Some organizations have it even be if it's within the same institution, right? So if there's a proposal that's coming in from the institution that you work at, even if you've never met this person before, you're not allowed to review that publication. So there is a lot that is done to try and make sure that the process can be as candid and free and open as possible without having to be concerned about these personal relationships.
Okay, so the next question is, you mentioned looking at successful grant applications. So I'm just wondering if you have any tips for how to ask someone. Is it okay to ask someone? Are there
Yeah.
specific people that you should approach to ask?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's best to start with people who you know, right? So obviously your mentor or other faculty in your department. I think this is just a plug also for cultivating different mentorship relationships as well, right? So rather than having your PI be your only mentoring relationship, it's really useful to have someone, maybe someone else in your department or a department at another institution that you collaborate with, someone who you can also go to and develop a mentoring relationship with. So I'd say definitely faculty members who you know are the best place to start. Perhaps other peers, other students or postdocs that you know in your department who have applied to this program. But then I will say sometimes you see people post on, maybe LinkedIn or others, social media sites where a lot of academics are operating, and say, would anyone be willing to share this with me? Has anyone applied to this program before and would be willing to share their application with a stranger who's really interested? I think that's not, it's not an inappropriate thing to ask, and someone might be interested in sending it to you. So I think don't be afraid to ask. But these are always sort of tricky things. I think people might be more inclined to share a funded proposal than one that wasn't funded,
Mhm.
because they might feel that, there's something about, well, this wasn't successful anyway. But oftentimes if something is successful, people are happy to share it because they're also proud of it.
That actually leads in nicely to the next question, which is, do you have any tips for digesting the information that you get from reviewer comments, especially if it was an unsuccessful application?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is don't take it personally, because I know that's easier said than done, because it is really difficult. You put yourself out there and to have that work criticized. But in most cases, again, there are always counter examples, but in most cases, reviewers sincerely want to provide helpful, constructive feedback, and funders usually tell them to, right? I mean, I've worked for programs before where we were really clear that part of your job as a reviewer is not just to tell us what you think about the project, but to give useful feedback to the applicant, something that is actionable for them to take and move forward with. And so I think a lot of reviewers take that task seriously. So hopefully your comments are, presented in a constructive way, even if they are highly critical or negative. And then I think the other thing to do would be, again, at this point in the early career stage, is to talk about it with a mentor or someone you trust, someone who can maybe give you a bit of more impartial read on what the reviewer said, or maybe help you interpret it in a way that is easier if they have a little distance, and so maybe sit down with your mentor and say, look, can we go through these comments and you tell me what you think? And sometimes you will find too that your mentor who has experience in this and who's done this many times themselves can read between the lines a little bit, right? Sometimes there's a little interpretation that happens in some of these comments, and they might be able to help you glean more information from them than might appear on the page.
Awesome. Okay, one more question, and then there may be a few in the Q&A that you could type
Sure.
in. Is it helpful to serve on grant panels? And are there ways for early career researchers to get involved in grant review if they haven't been awarded any grants? Or what advice do
Yes.
you have there?
Yes. So the short answer to your first question is yes. Definitely. If there's any way that you can get involved in reviewing proposals or being part of a review committee, that's fantastic. Or even honestly reviewing manuscripts, right? If you can sort of get your way into helping review for a journal as well, that's a translatable skill that I think would also transfer to your own grant writing. But sometimes, especially programs that are graduate fellowships, perhaps, or fellowships that are smaller, that might not be as high as stakes, are often, looking for people maybe at the postdoctoral level who might be able to contribute their time and expertise. So, I can't think of any sort of specific examples and say email so and so, but I think as you're looking through these different opportunities, if you see a program that maybe isn't the right fit for your project for you to apply to, but it might be something where you could contribute as a reviewer, reach out to them and offer your services. I can tell you that as program staff, one of the best emails I get is a random academic email me and saying, I just learned about your program and I would love to be a reviewer. That makes my day. So if you stumble upon a program that seems like a good fit from that perspective, reach out to them, because it might just be that they're looking for someone with your background.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vitvet. It was really useful.